Started the record button, so I want everyone to stop swearing, especially you, Carol. Swearing like a trooper. So first of all, we're starting with the regular agenda with a resolution to move into closed session.
Sorry, we got this special meeting.
Oh, this is a special one. You're right, okay, starting with the special one. So I'm calling it to order, looking for a disclosure of pecuniary interest from anyone. Seeing no hands go up on this one. Motion to move council into committee of the whole.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Dodd. City Council now move into committee of the whole to consider a presentation from Andrew Mirabella of Hampson Consulting regarding city of Town water and sewer rate studies.
So motion to go into committee of the whole. Travis, in favor?
In favor.
Scott?
In favor.
Brock? Marion?
Favor.
Carol?
In favor.
John Tammy, are you there yet? Oops, I skipped one. Brian, go ahead.
In favor.
And Richard.
In favor.
So that is carried. Now we're going to deputations and presentations. So we want to hear from Andrew Mirabella of Hampson. Well, probably Katie, you going to start? Do the introduction?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll do a quick introduction just to remind council sort of how we got here. You'll recall we met a couple months ago in council chambers. We had a special meeting and we presented to you some background on both water and wastewater services, some future planning for capital, as well as what our current revenue and ratepayer structure is. That is the information that provides the foundation for the report and the study that Hampson Consulting has done, and Andrew is here from Hampson to present the results of their study tonight. And then what this study does is it meets our requirements for the financial plan as required by the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it also provides a foundation for future changes to our rates that we will bring forward to council for council approval. So I will point out, Andrew has provided what they suggest our rates should be or need to be in order to meet the information as it was presented. Accepting this report by no means locks us into those rates. We'll have the ability to review those on an annual basis. And there is a report tonight in the regular council meeting to look at our rates for 2020, 2021. But we really are using the information in this report to be sort of our foundation for that and to understand what the implications are going forward, depending on what you decide to do with rates this year. So with that, I'll leave it up to Andrew. If you have questions about his study, I would recommend that you ask them here tonight. If you have questions about our rates for 2020, 2021 specific to that report, I'll ask that you hold them to have that report come forward at the regular council meeting.
Thanks, Kate. Over to you, Andrew.
Great, thanks for having me again. My name is Andrew Mirabella. I'm a senior consultant at Hampson. So we've been working quite closely with Kate and other city staff on developing this particular analysis and recognizing the results itself have kind of been changed a little bit, and some sensitivity tests surrounding the ongoing COVID situation. So we would be remiss if we were to bring forward analysis, obviously, that completely ignored what's been going on around the greater globe and whatnot. So anyways, before I leave with that, I guess hopefully everybody in the city is keeping well and keeping safe. And it's been some pretty tough times and some very difficult decisions, both from a corporate, economic, and some fiscal position at the city staff level. So this kind of just builds a little bit on that. And I think Hampson itself will be available certainly to help Kate along with future sensitivity tests and outlines as things progress, as more information becomes available. So that's something that we'll certainly be willing to work with the city on, because I don't think this is a static situation. I think there's going to be some changes and there'll be some fluid to it over the next several months. So I will go over what our draft results are with that, and keeping with my introduction. And then certainly from this point to Kate's earlier mention that this really sets the foundation to coincide with the Safe Drinking Water Act, the preparation of a financial plan, which following any consultation discussion today, will prepare a report which kind of outlines a little bit more detail, obviously, than what this draft outline looks at in terms of an overall summary. So just onto the next slide here, I'll go over what we are looking at from the background study objectives. So just overall, the city has maintained your water rates for the past 4 years while you're increasing your wastewater surcharge to fund capital and debt related requirements in an effort to obviously try to build up those reserves and try to manage your cost as your debt cost and on your wastewater side has increased quite substantially. The significant water, as I mentioned, is some significant wastewater debt on that system. What we are seeing over the planning period is that debt is actually coming offline. And so what we've tried to do is try to obviously smooth those impacts. And with the debt coming offline, we've tried to incorporate as much savings as we can onto the bill and smooth down the wastewater rates while also trying to contribute money into reserves. So those funds can be transferred, that available capacity can be used for future asset repair and replacement. So we did consider that throughout the planning period. I think we have to recognize there's some funds right now available to fund system costs in your reserve funds to start 2020, about 1.5 million for water and about almost $1 million for wastewater. That is, and sounds like a lot of money, but likely insufficient should some significant major repair or replacement be required. When we're looking at a replacement value of your system of upwards of $600 million, it's obviously a pretty small component relative to how costly water and wastewater infrastructure is. Just on the next slide, we can move down to the next one. Oh, there we go. So with that, the city has identified a fairly significant 10-year capital plan for your water and your wastewater systems. And we've used that as a fundamental basis to form our rate study. We've tried to calculate, what we like to call full cost recovery rates, ensuring our capital and our operating and our debt costs are certainly all sustainable and funded, as well as trying to put away some money for asset repair and replacement, while also trying to consider the affordability of the user rates over the long term. With this rate structure and with discussions with city staff, we haven't made any fundamental changes to your existing rate structure itself. Your rate structure is quite common in terms of your fixed charge versus and your variable rates in terms of inclining block. So we haven't made any departures from the way you currently charge. And as I mentioned, given the current economic climate and the existing situation, we've kind of done some additional sensitivity tests for council consideration, which kind of forms the basis and benchmark for Kate's recommendation, which you'll see in the staff report. Recognizing the current climate and potentially effectively holding the line on the rates for the 2020 to 2021 period. Just onto the next slide. Just to give a bit of a refresher what your current water rates are from a monthly perspective. The rates are on the fixed charge. You have a fixed charge and a consumption charge. Your fixed charges are differentiated by meter size. So you pay an increased charge on your fixed basis relative to the size of your water meter. So anyone who has a non-residential business or a larger pipe size will pay relatively more than a single family detached unit, which is usually on the 15 millimeter charge per month. The second component to that, in addition to your fixed charge, you would pay a consumption charge, and effectively you're charged on a rate per cubic meter basis. So relative to how much water you consume, you would pay for that water that's used each month. The block itself is a 2-block system, so it's inclining. So as you consume more water, you would actually pay an increased rate per cubic meter. That second block is really set to capture your non-residential users. So someone who is above or potentially an extremely high household user, which is probably pretty rare, but you would pay an increased charge per cubic meter relative to that water use. Your sewer charge is levied as a percentage of your water bill as a surcharge. So whatever you pay on your water bill, you would pay 124% of that to cover the sewer expense. And just as a note, any rural customers outside the city would pay double the fixed and consumption rates, which are currently levied in the city of Owen Sound. And that is proposed to continue. Just on to the next slide. Just keeping into consideration what we talked a little bit about the rate structure itself, I did want to review to see if there was any warrant potentially adjust the relationship, and we like to call it the fixed versus variable rate cost recovery relationship, looking at what a typical household pays in terms of what their fixed charges are relative to their variable rates meaning their consumption charges. And what we found just from a survey of obviously some surrounding jurisdictions across Simcoe County, as well as some other jurisdictions in the range of City of Owen Sound, is that your fixed charge represents about 52% of the current charge. So almost a 50-50 split between your fixed charge and your variable rate for a typical household consuming about 200 cubic meters a year. That relationship is quite constant and about just above the average of what we see from some of these surrounding jurisdictions at 47% cost from your fixed component. So we didn't see too much of a reason to adjust that relationship. Certainly, the more emphasis we place on the variable rate consumption puts more emphasis on the end user and their consumption patterns, and that would affect the rates, which would obviously in turn affect the city's revenues if should there be any significant variance in how much water those end users are consuming. And truthfully, in a period as of right now, with some significant volatility in the non-residential base and potentially others at home or being at home a lot more, there could be some abnormal consumption patterns is what you might see in the end of the year. And having a rate structure that's more weighted to your consumption component could more adversely affect the city's revenues at the end of the year, perhaps already more than what we're already going to experience just from a lot of non-residential businesses being closed for a period of time. So, having a rate structure which is almost 50-50 to the extent of the existing situation is probably as beneficial as it could be, while giving still the end user control of the water bill, while also maintaining some revenue security for the city. Just on to the next slide. Just to provide a bit of an overview of your water and wastewater infrastructure. Both water and wastewater, your linear infrastructure, your mains, is the biggest component representing the majority of the infrastructure within the city. Kate went through this in quite some detail at the last presentation a few months ago, but I won't spend too much time on it. But just keeping in the context of we are looking at a replacement value of your system of upwards of about $630 million. When we look at asset replacement and asset management practice, we always want to look at what the replacement value of the infrastructure is, not the tangible capital asset values of what you might see as your financial statements as the historical value or depreciated value. We need to look at what it would cost to replace that water main today or that pumping infrastructure today, because that's what your capital budget is based on actual replacement costs of today. So relatively speaking, the city does own a significant amount of infrastructure to provide these services, and that those infrastructures have to be maintained. On to the next slide. We'll get into the rate setting and financial analysis now. It's just a break slide if we can go to the next one. Just to provide a bit of a context in terms of our approach here. The flow chart, we really start our analysis off at looking at what the consumption patterns and projection of new users is going to be based on relatively the development charge forecast that we have. Once we have a forecast of new users and connections and the amount of water consumed, we then look at what the cost analysis is. We look at all your operating expenditures, as well as your capital forecast. When we look at the capital forecast, we look at both growth and non-growth. And when we consider from a rate setting perspective, we try to capture the non-growth related cost. Anything growth related, we offset from development charges. We then look at any non-user rate revenues, which are going to be coming in, which is a fairly small revenue source for the city, interest charges, penalty charges. It's pretty minor in the grand scheme of your total revenues generated, but nonetheless, we take those revenues into account and we make sure we offset them over the total cost that's provided. The floating box there on the left is our capital asset lifecycle analysis, and that relates to that $630 million of infrastructure that you have. How do we plan for the future replacement of that infrastructure over the long term? And we bring in components of trying to fund that over the base of the planning period. And obviously, we don't come nowhere near to achieving what those goals are, but we're trying to get the city on the track in order to consider what those life cycle costs are. Once we consider our capital, operating, and contribution to reserve, we have what we like to call as our net rate funding requirement. That's the amount of money that we consider to be required to be funded for both the water and the wastewater rates. And then they get divided out between the forecast of flow and number of new users, which gives us the rates that we establish for each of the connections, for each of the systems. Sorry. So that's important. We're going to give the city the model in order to calculate these rates, so they have the ability to test the scenarios and kind of review this on an ongoing basis. And effectively, every component of our model represents a tab or a box that we've identified here. So it is quite a bit of a complex process, and we're trying to simplify it. Just on the following slide. Just going in again, a bit more detail on the rate setting approach. We consider it in terms of three components. We have our full recovery of our operating costs. The analysis and the assumptions are based on the city's 2020 budget. We've adjusted the cost to account for inflation at effectively a cost center, a group level. Certain components that increased at a higher level than the rate of inflation, fuel, hydro, gas, things like that, which is typically increased at a greater rate. We've incorporated some of those assumptions going forward. Once we've identified the operating costs, we then have our recovery of annual capital needs. Again, we've identified the 10-year capital plan based on the city's projections, which have been provided to us, as well as future discussions with staff. Only those non-growth related costs, which we consider for repair and replacement, are included. DC shares have been netted off and accounted for in incorporating the capital plan. There are some years in which the capital plan, we've identified some significant projects. And in those years, we've assumed there's going to be some form of debenture financing. It's really on the water capital program in 2021 and in 2023. Certainly, when those projects come in and given the climate, things might change or might be deferred. But obviously, those expenditures will be determined at the time of that capital, and they can be changed accordingly. The last point there is just on our grants. We've assumed there's going to be some for key projects which are effectively contingent on funding. And those grant fundings are incorporated into the model. So we tried to look at external sources where the project is contingent or reliant on that, and those funds are incorporated into the model. And the third component, again, being that provision for future asset replacement, trying to recognize that there's a substantial volume replacement value of infrastructure, which needs to be considered over the long term. So just on the next slide, I'll just talk briefly about the future demand assumptions before we get into the cost analysis. We've based our forecast of new connections primarily on the 2019 DC study that Hempson prepared, as well as kind of discussions in terms of historical assumptions, patterns and growth patterns and so on. So we effectively assumed about 500 equivalent connections that will be brought onto the city over the 10-year period. So about 50 new units a year, and the rural connections are effectively static. Obviously, any additional growth that's outside of the 50 would obviously bring in additional revenue that potentially we didn't capture. But we also don't want to overestimate the potential amount of new growth. If we overestimate the growth, then we fall short on our revenue expectations, in which it creates a bigger funding gap for the city. So we're trying to manage both ends of the spectrum, and it's a reasonable expectation to base it on what those DC study projections are. So that's on the future demand side. Just on the following slide, and the next one, we look at what the consumption patterns are. And just Kate provided a much more of a lengthier snapshot in the previous one. We're just looking at it from the most recent 3-year period and looking at block 1 and block 2 consumption. When we look at water rates and setting utility rates, we only look at the consumption that's billed to the end user. So only what's actually metered and what's charged for. Any production at the plant level is sometimes in which you might see is different from what's actually billed to the end user. There's system usage, water loss, which we don't capture in the rate setting analysis. What we're seeing across Ontario municipalities and really all municipalities across Canada and North America is water consumption is declining on both a per capita basis and a household consumption basis. So we did want to be cognizant of that. And even with the new growth that we are projecting, we wanted to continue to decline our consumption. So we've declined the consumption at a pretty modest rate, but recognizing that on an overall per capita basis with the new growth that's occurring and new people coming into the city, as well as the new employment, consumption will continue to decline over that long term. These are the types of assumptions that we certainly encourage the city to continue to monitor and watch those trends, how it could affect the revenues. And in 3 to 5 years time from now, when the study gets updated, these are the types of things that we'll reevaluate to look at if the consumption trends have been declining at a more rapid or more modest pace than what we've assumed. So just on the next slide. So just to be clear in terms of the rate structure itself, there is no change. We're going to keep the fixed charge and the variable rate. Fixed charge is on a per month basis, and your consumption charge is inclining block rate structure on a per cubic meter basis. So this is a really, for your information purposes slide, we already kind of discussed this. On to the next slide. So I think what's trying to capture all those little components that we talked about in terms of the analysis in regards to our costs and our revenues. The answer really comes down to how much revenue really needs to be collected from the water rate. So what we have here is just a snapshot of our cost analysis, and anything above zero is effectively our cost. The gold bar is our operating cost, the light gray is our non-growth related capital, and our red is our contributions to and from the reserve funds. And that red bar comes below and on top and below zero. When it's below zero, that means we're taking money from our reserves to pay for capital. When it's above zero, we're contributing to the reserve fund when there's available money to do that. The green bars relate to any debt financing that's come in or we're required to in order to offset years of high capital. And we have our non-related revenues, which also include our grant funding as well, which we've assumed for certain years where there's high capital towards the back end of the planning period. Our smooth line that's dotted goes across, and that effectively looks at what the smooth annual rate increases need to be, and the amount of money that needs to be collected each year to fund our capital or operating program that we've identified. And that's the amount that needs to be funded through the user rate. So we manage our reserve fund contributions to and from in order to make that linear projection each year, which has our linear rate increases that we'll show on the subsequent slides. And we try to do that reverse reserve fund management in order to do that. It's a very similar story for the wastewater, but I do want to spend a little bit of time with you on this slide because it's the same concept. But generally speaking, obviously our cost increases are going up, partially inflation related, and our capital program driven by a significant repair and replacement program is what's driving the need. And we're also trying to put some money away in order to save for future repair and replacement. On the next slide, we have the same graph in terms of what needs to be funded from the sewer rates. What we're showing here is, I think it's again the same concept. What you might notice is the line itself isn't as increasing as much, and that kind of gives away into what we might see in the coming slides in terms of the rate increases. But on the sewer side, as we've increased the sewer surcharges quite substantially over the last number of years, that surcharge is actually going to be leveling off as we've accumulated some money into reserves, and as the water rates continue to increase, that surcharge can at some point level off and potentially be decreasing over that period. And with that being said, we also have a decline in your debt costs and your debt expenditures, which will be incorporated into the analysis and incorporated into the rates. So that's also why you see some leveling off kind of after 2025 onto how much money needs to be funded from those wastewater rates and wastewater revenues. So just on going on to the next slide, effectively, we'll get into what those impacts mean and what those results are looking like. So we have on the following slide here is the rate impact for a typical household consuming 200 cubic meters a year. Again, so before we get into this is the scenario, assuming that we ensure we undertake all our operating costs and we undertake the capital program as is, assuming rate increases were to be going into effect in this July of 2020. There's been some sensitivity tests around that, and we'll show you what those look like, but this would be what we consider the status quo type scenario for the city of Owen Sound. So we have current rates of a typical household about $1,293. We would see, in order to continue to carry out this type of a program, about 5% rate increases over the next several years. Following down in 2024, those rate increases then taper down to about 4% per annum after that. We got to keep, I guess, just be cognizant of when we look at the rates itself, this is also including the effects of inflation. So increasing operating costs account for about 2.5% of that. So half that rate increase is really looking at inflationary increases just associated with operating that system, plus your capital program and considering your debt management expenditures and so on. So there is all those components that are built in to the analysis of the rate. So, we are looking at obviously above around a 5% increase, but then tapering down to 4%. Most of that is on the water side, where we are seeing a continuation of 5% increases over that period. But come 2024, we're actually going to start to decrease our sewer surcharge. So it tapers down to about 110% in 2030, as opposed to the 124% it currently is right now. So just on the next slide, effectively probably reiterates what I just said, but the calculated water rates on the fixed charge, just to be explicit, we calculated 5% per year from 2020 to 2030. The similar rate increase on the consumption side, 5% per annum from 2020 to 2030. And on the wastewater side, we have a consumption surcharge maintained to 2023 before retreating down to 110% by 2030. We wanted to be cautious, especially on the wastewater side, not to start the retreating of that surcharge down too early, because we do have a significant component of your wastewater budget is debt related. So until some of that debt starts to come off in that 2024, 2025 period, then we'll feel more comfortable about retreating down that sewer surcharge. So we want to make sure we have enough revenue in order to at least maintain our charges, which aren't going to effectively change our costs on our operating and debt costs, which don't really change much with use. Those are costs you're going to have to incur. So just going on the next slide. So I think we need to be looking at this from a very broad perspective, and those rate increases are relative to the capital, but what implications do those rate increases and does that effect have on your reserve fund and your reserve fund balances? So this slide, I think, kind of nicely tracks your reserve fund ending balances over the planning period, and shows tracking from 2018 through 2020. We see some changes, certainly a decline in your water reserve fund balances, but generally speaking, your water reserves, even with those rate increases up into 2025 or 2026, doesn't grow all that significantly. On the wastewater side, we're seeing some increases, but then a pretty significant draw from reserves in 2025. And then after that 2025, 2026 period, we see the reserve funds continuing to increase. Part of that rate of increase is, as we get towards the back end of the period, the certainty around our costs obviously becomes a little less certain. Capital programs are going to change, your operating costs are going to change. There could be new government mandates on costs. So things like that aren't, it's tough to capture and conceptualize at this particular time, which is why we obviously try to recommend rate studies for every 3 to 5 years. But we did want to put that into perspective and show what those rate increases look like, or the reserve funds over that period. And with that said, we look at a 2030 closing balance of $6.8 million and your wastewater reserve fund of about $8.9 million. We'll get into it in the next slide, but just keeping that in mind of, we're looking at $7 million and $9 million by the end of the planning period relative to the current value of your infrastructure at $630 million before accounting for that replacement value for the effects of inflation as well, which brings it probably closer to $650 or $660 million. So there is a pretty still a substantial difference in terms of total replacement value and your reserve. Just on the next slide, this that will tie into my comments quite well. So what I've shown here is looking at what we see in other municipalities in terms of typical minimum reserve fund balances and what they consider through their policy objectives, and recognizing the city hasn't formally adopted any reserve fund management policies on this respect, but this might be something that they could look at or consider from a go-forward basis. Some municipalities and the American Water Works and Ontario Water Works Association, Canadian Water Works Association look at how much money in terms of the minimum, in terms of months of operating expenditures that you have, or the percentage of your replacement value of your infrastructure that you would have, and how much money relative to those couple of metrics should you be keeping into your reserve fund. So what we have here is just looking at it from a minimum perspective of 3 months operating plus 1.5% of your asset replacement value to be kept into reserves. And you see when we look at tracking that over the period, your black line represents that minimum target, which the minimum target is increasing as a result of we're just adjusting that minimum target for inflation relative to today. But over the period, both water and wastewater combined, we really only kind of exceed that minimum target by 2030. And the preceding years we're still well below that minimum component. And I can appreciate that you might feel differently about the 1.5%. But just kind of keeping an average of what we see in other municipalities that range from 1% all the way to 4% in terms of asset replacement value. We did want to put something in there for representation purposes for your consideration. But, so I just to keep that into the context of where we're trying to go to and what's kind of guiding some of those rate increases going forward. So just on the following slide. So, just to kind of cap off on the status quo, I think every municipality and every council likes to see this slide in terms of what the current rates are relative to what we've calculated relative to some surrounding jurisdictions. From my perspective, I think it is important, but I think a slide like this also comes with a series of caveats that we need to tell you about. Every municipality and every jurisdiction has different servicing requirements, cost of operating their system, the way they treat their water, and the way the water, where it comes from, all play a part in terms of what the total cost is that gets translated to the end user. In addition to that, different municipalities with economies of scale or the land area to which they're delivering that service and the replacement value of their infrastructure, again, all plays a role into coming up with how those costs are delivered and what that means to the end user at the end of the year. So Owen Sound's rates kind of are now at the kind of the middle end to high end of middle to high end perspective here. With those 5% rate increase that we've identified for that 2020 to 2021 period, we maintained a similar relationship in terms of your position relative to other communities, less than the likes of perhaps a Meaford or Mare or a Tay Township, but kind of certainly more expensive than some of those communities out in Wasaga Beach or the town of the Blue Mountains or the city of Orillia. There is a series of users that are between Clearview and Pentanguishene, which are, you're all within a very small proportion in terms of user rate. So I think we just need to be cognizant of that. There's not a vast difference in the total quantum of the charge between you, that you're kind of in that one group. And you really only see that big difference when you get down to the town of Blue Mountains, which are well under $1,000. Again, the only other kind of point I would like to make here is just the one that's right beside you, the District of Muskoka. Those rates are just the utility rates. They actually have a tax supported assessment component that they incorporate on the utility rates, which isn't included in there, and get charged to certain users. So that might be a bit misleading. They're probably, if you add in all the assessment components, they would be on the higher end of the spectrum, but just to flag that for your information. So just on the following slide, we get into the alternative scenarios that we've tested as part of this analysis. And there's really two that come up on slide number 21 on the next one. We've tested the rate scenario of, well, if council were to continue to increase just at the rate of a simple inflationary measure of 2% per year, what would that look like on the water rates? And effectively, that means your wastewater surcharge at 124% would be maintained throughout the 10-year period to manage those 2% rate increases. And we'll show you what that means in terms of your reserve funds on the following slide, because that's really what the right relationship is looking like. We know what the rates currently are, and if you just add 2%, that's what it would be looking like. The second scenario is a bit more akin to what Kate will be proposing in the staff report. Effectively, no rate increase in the July 2020 period, recognizing the COVID situation. But what Hempson decided to do in terms of testing what that sensitivity would look like, as a result of holding the line on the rates in the current year, if we were to then increase the rates in order to achieve a similar reserve fund target as we had under the status quo scenario, assuming we were to be increasing the rates at 5% this year, what does that look like in terms of the end target? So that means we would have to effectively increase the rates, obviously at a higher percentage than what I showed you at 5%, it's closer to 6%, in order to make up for the lost revenue that we would have achieved. Instead of keeping the rates at 0% this year, we would have increased them at that 5%. So just trying to manage what those increases look like. With that scenario, the wastewater surcharge is maintained at 124% to 2024, and then decreased throughout the 10-year planning period to 104% in 2030. Again, aiming to replicate that 2030 reserve fund balance of the base case scenario. So on the following slide, we do have what the estimated year-end 2030 reserve fund balance comparison is. So what we have here is, again, looking solely at the 2030 ending targets. We have the base case, which is what we've just showed in terms of tracking of your reserve funds. The scenario one is the rate increases of 2% per annum. So what's evident here is that if the city were to continue with the capital program that we've identified and costs were to increase at the same pace, a 2% increase on the utility rates year in and year out over the next 10 years would be insufficient in order to carry out that program. keeping in mind our operating costs are increasing at a rate of about 2.5%. So we're not keeping track with at least what way our costs are going up. And with the capital program and the significant expenditures required, we would be put into a negative position on both water and wastewater. Certainly on the water side, the negative reserve fund position is a lot more substantial by the end of the period. On the scenario 2 is the increase that we talked about. It would be closer to 6%, but holding the line on the rates in July of 2020, which would be now. So we come out with, you'll see, with a very similar target in terms of your base case scenario and your scenario 2, which is the intention of doing that. So, I recognize this is, this would be considering all those factors in order to achieve that. If the city were to be deferring capital or doing other items at your council, each year during council deliberations and budget deliberations, that would obviously affect what the quantum of the rate impacts would be. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that a lot of these non-growth or repair and replacement of infrastructure needs to be done, whether it's deferred a year or 2 years. The need is there, and if staff has identified those needs, there might be some intermediate type patchwork or work that can be done, but effectively over the long run, there's the work that needs to be done. So we need to be cognizant of that over the long-term plan. So I think that on the last slide, I think we'll cap off my presentation. I apologize, I'm running a little bit over time, but I think what from our perspective, we will certainly would like to hear what council has to say and what we can do to finalize the results and any of the scenarios based on these discussions. And we'll certainly take that back with Kate following this to see what we can do. We'll refine the analysis as required and help prepare anything to support the submission of your financial plan. And we'll prepare that report as well in order to complete this and have a rate study report, which can guide Kate and your finance staff on a go-forward basis. And we'll give them the Excel model to complement that to help along with those rate studies. That concludes my 25-minute ramble, and I will gladly take some questions if there's any.
Thanks. Are there any councillors out there that have questions?
Yeah, I've got one. What would the recommendation have looked different if COVID had never happened?
So that's a good question. I think the recommendation, if COVID didn't happen, is our base case scenario, which is the 5% per year. That assumes that the rate increases would be coming into effect. And what and Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but the recommendation that will be coming forward afterwards is to kind of maintain your existing rates for a year, recognizing COVID.
That's correct. So moving started in February, we were going to move forward with doing the rate study, and frankly, I would be bringing forward a recommendation to increase the rates based on Hempson's analysis. However, given the environment we have and the economic pressures on the ratepayer, I recognize that there may not be a huge appetite to increase our rates by that much. And so very close to the end of the work, I called Andrew and said, I need you to do another scenario with a 0% increase, as I just anticipated that would be something that council would be more interested in this fiscal year.
So, other questions, Brock, or was that it?
No, that was good. Thank
you. Other councillors?
John Tamming here. Andrew, thank you for that. I'm just watching Richard and thinking about shaving, so I don't know. Andrew, what would help me is knowing, and maybe Kate can provide this, perhaps not now, it would assist me, and I suspect others, in knowing our minimum statutory requirements. What is the minimum reserve we have to hold back and so forth? Is that a complicated answer?
Not a complicated, but a good question. There is nothing in any form of legislation that identifies what a minimum balance should look like. From a statutory perspective, even the Safe Drinking Water Act, they just say from a reporting perspective, council has to deem the drinking water system financially viable with no specific parameters around it. It's up to council to determine what those minimums look like, given the information you have.
Thank you so much. And just a quick follow-up. If interest rates are predicted to be low for a very long time, I think the experts have conceded that.
Yep.
Why don't we just take our chances, keep the reserve very low, and if we run into problems, borrow? What's the answer to that? Thank you. I'll check off with that.
All good questions. Well, I think we have to be prepared for, they might be low for, 3 to 5 year period, but we're also looking at debt costs, which could be 10, 20 years. So they will go up. And I think we need to be cognizant of potentially that. And, you have other considerations of your annual repayment limit, how much you can borrow. I'm not sure where you currently are relative to that. But you also have significant debt on your system on the wastewater side. And I know when we initiated this process, and a bit of a different world 3 months ago when we were kind of ready to come to council, but things got delayed, interest rates were going on the rise. And Kate was, the understanding was council didn't want to undertake more new debt. You wanted to minimize your new debt. So that's kind of the lens. But from an economic perspective, we really take a long-term look at things, and you might be able to achieve some favorable interest costs now, but we really have to look things over the long term. That might put your system in a worse financial position going forward if we have too much debt going on the long term.
Nothing to add to that, Kate?
I'd only add in that our ARL is based on total city debt, so it's not just the debt on our water and wastewater system, it's the debt that we pay through our tax rates as well.
Thanks. Other questions from council? No one out there in the room? Scott has a question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. I have a couple questions for you. If you could just, to start with, clarify a couple numbers for me. You've used a user number of 8,359 in the presentation for total users. In the February study, we had 7,152 owner held accounts and 587 tenant.
Yep.
7,339 active, 265 without wastewater. So those are the ones that we double.
So
it's 80, 59, and 410.
So through the mayor, through the chair, the number that's reported there is the number of equivalent connections. So we bring everything down to an equivalent residential unit number. So the connections that are greater than the 15 millimeter get, I guess, prorated and get factored up. So it's all on a level playing field. So what we're showing there is just an equivalent residential unit number. So it does match in terms of total connections, the numbers that you mentioned.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Second question, water costs and wastewater costs are approximately 342 million and 289.6 million. What extent is surface treatment and subsurface costs considered as part of that? So do you consider asphalt the top 6 inches of dressing, or do you just have a meter cost that is not including those?
That's a good question. So we effectively take the tangible, it's perhaps not as complex. We take the tangible capital asset inventory data that we have from staff and the latest replacement cost information that was there, and we've been inflated them or indexed them up to current dollars for replacement. So it only takes into account the way the information was presented in the city's database, and we've just adjusted those costs for the rate of inflation.
So perhaps
Through you to the mayor, we do not include those surface treatments in our asset management or tangible capital asset costs for the underground infrastructure.
Okay. Third question, Andrew. It would appear that it's approximately a 66% annualized cost increase over the 10 years, starting at about 6 million a year, rising to about 10 million. What would you most attribute the drivers to that being? You do a lot of rate studies all over. Anything stand out in relation to other municipalities there?
So in your particular context, certainly it's the capital program on the water side in terms of us trying to grapple with the non-growth related costs and trying to replenish some of those reserve funds and put some funds away over that period. In addition to that, because in the water capital program, there are years in which we don't have sufficient funds available, debt costs are required. So we have assumed some additional debt that would be carried out or required in order to carry out that program. So principal and interest costs are incorporated into that as well. You know, from what we see in other municipalities, from the comparable perspective, it's usually the capital programs which drive a lot of the rate increases and the capital projects and the reserve fund contribution. So relative to what municipalities, where they stand on their reserves, how much money they currently have, and how they're able to use or draw upon those funds in order to fund their capital, certainly plays a role into how those costs escalate over that period.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Travis, anyone else in the room? Seeing none. I think those are all the questions, Andrew. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you, Kate, for your work on this.
Get a motion to receive.
I will need a motion to receive, which Travis has stuck his hand up to move receipt of that report. We'll go through. All in favor, Travis?
Favor.
Scott?
In favor.
Brock?
Favor?
Marion?
In favor.
Carol?
In favor?
Brian?
In favor.
John?
In favor?
And Richard?
Favor.
That is carried. Again, thank you. Next, to try and complete this meeting so we can get upstairs in time, motion that the committee of the whole rise and report.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, that the committee of the whole rise and report.
Councillor Dodd?
In favor.
Councillor Gregg?
In favor.
Councillor Hamley?
In favor?
Councillor Kepke?
In favor.
Councillor Merton?
In favor?
Deputy Mayor O'Leary?
In favor.
Councillor Tamming? Okay, and Councillor Thomas?
In favor.
Thank you. So that's carried. Now back in formal session.
Moved by Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Dodd, that the act taken in committee of the whole in considering the presentation from Andrew Mirabella of Hemson Consulting regarding City of Old Town water and sewer rate study be confirmed by this council.
And all in favor, Councillor Dodd.
In favor.
Councillor Hamley.
In favor?
Kepke.
In favor.
Merton.
In favor?
Mayor O'Leary.
In favor.
Councillor Tamming.
Favor.
And Councillor Thomas.
In favor.
What's next? Bylaw?
Confirmatory.
So confirmatory bylaw to confirm the proceedings that we've just gone through. Go ahead, Scott.
Moved by myself, Councillor Gregg, seconded by Councillor Dodd, that bylaw number 2020-046 be passed and enacted.
And in favor, Councillor Dodd.
In favor.
Councillor Gregg.
In favor.
Councillor Hamley.
In favor?
Councillor Kepke.
In favor.
Thanks. Councillor Merton.
In favor?
Deputy Mayor O'Leary.
In favor.
Councillor Tamming.
In favor.
Councillor Thomas.
In favor.
Good. So that completes our business in this special meeting. We'll adjourn it. We'll see you upstairs in 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. See you again.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll